This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Jay-Z Microphones, PreSonus, Spectra 1964, and API Audio. So get ready to rock.
A larger perspective on art is that you have to give art enough space to be whatever it wants to be. You start off with an idea of what you're going for, but don't force it. Like say you're working a piece of wood, you're going to have a knot here and there. You got to work around those natural characteristics and not try to make them a blemish, but make them a natural feature. That's what beauty is. It's about framing the natural features that are already there.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. If you feel like the fast pace of computer tech has made your studio Mac obsolete, then think again. OWC is your personal studio tech for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs perfect for recording and mixing. Why ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with the Mac you've already got? Learn how to supercharge your studio and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC.com so that you can focus on making great music. If you want a digital audio workstation that will give life to your music, from sketching a new idea to composing, editing, mixing, and mastering a finished record, then you want Studio One from PreSonus. Studio One is easy to use with intuitive drag-and-drop simplicity, making it great for beginners yet flexible and powerful for experienced producers. Whether creating beats, recording a band, or composing a blockbuster film soundtrack, you will find everything you need to create your masterpiece. Download your free version of Studio One Prime and get started now at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. Hey Rockstars, it's Lid Shaw and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Kevin White, a Nashville-based musician, audio engineer, musicologist, film composer, and audio educator. As an audio engineer, Kevin has worked with national corporate clients, films, radio, rock bands, and gained a reputation for his retro-futuristic aesthetics. I feel like I need a special effect on like aesthetics. He's taught classes on mixing and lo-fi production techniques. That's awesome. Kevin is also a voting member of the Recording Academy and works full-time for the audio production college SAE Institute here in Nashville, Tennessee. A notable milestone in Kevin's career has been his contributions to the NASA Apollo Flight Journal. His musicology and audio restoration work have contributed to the preservation of American spaceflight history, as well as expanding the frontiers of musicology. Kevin was also part of the newly released documentary film Teslafy Me in 2019, which presents the history of renewable energy and the authentic story of Nikola Tesla from the perspective of his Balkan homeland. As the film's composer and sound supervisor, Kevin specifically used sounds from Tesla's lifetime. He mixed the instrumentation of an old-fashioned Serbian string band with early electronic instruments from the era, including the Theremin, Ondas Martino, Hammond Novacord, and Hammond Solovox. Cool sounding stuff. He also used source samples of vintage equipment, including electric arcs, Tesla coils, and a Bell's Labs Voder. I can't wait to find out what that is, in order to create a unique sonic signature for the film. So, super excited to have you here. Please welcome Kevin White to Recording Studio Rockstars. Kevin, are you ready to rock, dude?
Absolutely.
Dude, it's awesome to have you here, man. And
Thanks for having me.
You have such a unique introduction and bio to all the things you've done, man. I love it.
Awesome.
So what about some of the words I was trying to pronounce there? Like, what is the Ondas Martino?
The Ondas Martino, it is a French instrument. It's sort of the French equivalent of the Theremin. It was a and it's mostly known these days as an instrument that Johnny Greenwood plays from Radiohead from time to time. But it's a really cool historical instrument. At the time that the Theremin came out, became popularized really in the late 20s and mid 30s. But around that time, there were several competing designs that wanted to sort of incorporate the ability to track your pitch a little easier.
So that's one of the challenges of
right.
Theremin,
So most people are familiar with the contraption that Moog made for the Beach Boys to play good vibrations. I'm forgetting the title, but there were versions of that type of thing that go way back to the 30s.
Actually, what is the contraption that he created for the Beach Boys? So they weren't just like naturally gifted at Theremin?
On the actual studio recording, if I'm not mistaken, I think it is an actual thereminist, but they had to play it live. So they created basically a controller that to the eye it looks sort of like a steel guitar that basically has a visual reference for their finger to slide left and right.
Oh, that's clever.
The keyboard. But it's basically just sine wave.
Can I get one of those for my vocals? I guess it's called auto-tune.
There you go.
Awesome. And then let's see, what else was in there? The Hammond Nova chord and the Hammond Solo Vox.
Right. Yeah, the Solo Vox and the Nova chord, Hammond actually made the first synthesizer, the first analog synthesizer way back in the late 1930s. A lot of people don't realize this. And interesting tidbit, in 1939, they released this in time for the World's Fair, which is a big deal. A lot of things came out in 1939 for the World's Fair.
Where was that World's Fair? That wasn't the Chicago? No, Chicago was like late 1800s.
Right, yeah, that's the Chicago Exposition. No, I believe that one was in New York, if I'm not mistaken. So the very first one off the assembly line, they actually presented it to President Roosevelt. Wow. And that was kind of this claim to fame, like, this is presidential quality.
Nice. Presidential quality Hammonds.
Right. But interesting note, that was not an uncommon practice. Like the Theremin, a lot of people don't realize, was originally presented to Lenin in the Soviet Union, and Lenin was so taken with it that he sponsored it and sent Theremin on a tour of the Soviet Union to promote the electrification of the country. So think about this. This is a point when most of Russia didn't even have electricity, and there he is with the freaking Theremin making music out of the air, just completely blowing people's minds.
Wow.
And it was a pretty nice piece of propaganda. So it's just kind of an example of music and art going into politics. And I'm really big into the relationship between science and art.
Of course, we're talking about Lenin the politician, not Lenin the musician.
Exactly.
Right on.
Yeah. And, I could do an entire podcast just on Leon Theremin, because this guy has his fingers in so many pies. He was into espionage and all types of stuff. Like literally he invented the bug, the espionage bug that we are all familiar with now. He invented this thing. It was in our embassy for like 7 years before we found it.
Really?
Yeah. And that's partly what was alluded to in the historical recordings that I'm sure we'll probably talk about in a moment from Apollo 11. There they are on the way to and from the moon. They're bringing music to commemorate different moments. They have a discussion with ground control about the music. It's this album, this Theremin album, and they have a discussion about its significance, sort of tip of the hat to the Russians, but also hey, I got you. I know Theremin was doing this.
That's a trip, man.
It gets really, really deep. The history is interesting.
Yeah. When does Netflix come out with the miniseries all about that bug being in the embassy? I feel like I just saw something like that. What was it? What am I thinking?
That's a good question. There's a lot about it on YouTube. I'm not sure about Netflix.
Cool, man. Awesome. Well, so that brings up a topic. I know we're jumping right in here, but before we got going, you and I started talking about all kinds of things. I was like, we better get started or we're going to miss all the good stuff. And one of them was me remembering that, back going on eBay and stuff like that and discovering all this great synthesis culture from Russia. There were these funky Russian synths that were listed on there, and I was so intrigued. And now hearing you talk about, Lenin and the Theremin back then, I can see maybe there was a birth of sort of synth culture at that point.
Absolutely. There's way more there than most people realize. There was a technology in Russia that predates most electronic music that we know of that was based on photocell technology. So basically, the early film projectors, they had a stripe of sound on the
Optagon we were just looking at upstairs here.
Right, like that. And these guys would actually draw sound on the side. It became this art form where they would actually draw soundtracks. And you can now, this is something that was a lot of this history was lost for a long, long time. Now you can literally go to YouTube and listen to some of these clips. And it's music that sounds like 8-bit music. It sounds like Nintendo music, but from the 1920s.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's really cool.
We need to put that in the show notes too.
Absolutely.
Is there a name that we want to remember right now? Not to put you on the spot for that. But.
Yeah, you could probably optical sound or visual sound, Russia.
All right,
those are some great. I'll get you a couple of great links there. But yeah, there were musicologists that doubted the existence of this stuff. But the really cool story there is that there are a few different technologies that were there. They're being developed that literally were lost in World War II. Literally lost. There's a fable, if you will, about the last bomb that dropped on Leningrad, destroying the studio that housed a lot of this equipment. Yeah, it's just epic. It's epic.
You're basically saying the studio battle started long before the one I'm waging here or battling here in Nashville. we were blowing up studios in other countries. Oh God, that's terrible.
It was the Germans. The Germans dropped the bomb, but
okay, all right.
We did it.
So, any other stuff you remember about like sort of synth culture in Russia?
Oh my goodness, yeah. There's tons of it. I personally own the first solid body guitar manufactured in the Soviet Union. Not like the one, but the model. It's a really, really cool guitar. There's lots of cool gear that came out because they had to kind of invent it all over again because they didn't have American examples to pull from. They would eyeball it and kind of figure out what they thought it would be. But if you tear some of this stuff open, man, it's interesting. Just tearing into this guitar, like the pickups are wound in a really interesting way, and they're held together with paper, and I pulled it apart, and it was literally newspaper from the Soviet Union from the 60s. They used to wrap this stuff. But the point is, they couldn't just go buy parts in their system, in their culture. They didn't have parts available, so you had to kind of know a guy at a factory that could pull a few parts for it. Like it's very kind of mafia-esque.
Yeah.
Things fall off a truck sometimes.
It's funny too to remember that a lot of early electronics, they're DIY everything, there's probably a lot, like coiling your own pickups. That's literally something you can just physically do and teach yourself how to do it. And it's how, Leo Fender was first making his pickups too and all that. I don't know anything about it. I haven't tried it, but I'm always fascinated by it. What are some components that there's no way you could ever recreate? Obviously solid state circuits, a transistor, you can't just fabricate a transistor, can you?
Well,
sorry to put you on the spot with a question like that.
Actually you,
and I asked this
not sure about the transistor per se, but I mean things like capacitors. You can make those. Yeah, like paper and oil capacitors, things like that. They would make themselves. But things like and
resistors.
Right. So that level of early electronics, they're making this stuff literally from scratch. Once it got to the more complicated things like transistors, then it became a little more difficult.
Yeah, even tubes with the vacuum that you need and all that.
Right, exactly. But transistors, that's an interesting one because the variances that were involved were nowhere near as standardized, and the manufacturing process was so difficult that one organ or synthesizer would sound drastically different than the next one. Drastically different.
Well, cool, man. I've been just jumping right into cool, fun topics, but tell us a little bit more about yourself, man. Like who are you? And whoops, excuse me, I just dropped my glasses. How'd you, get to be here in Nashville teaching this stuff and making such cool music?
Yeah, well, my music story goes way, way back. The way I like to tell is if you put a pin in the map of what I call the music triangle of Muscle Shoals, Memphis, and Nashville, I come from right in between.
Okay,
little town, middle of nowhere, Sardis, Tennessee, but it's pretty close to Jackson. And I grew up, every weekend, every chance I got, driving to Jackson, hanging out at the guitar shops, bumping into Carl Perkins without even knowing who he was.
Well, Sardis sounds awfully close to TARDIS, so there's some sci-fi connection going on there too.
There you go. But also for a while I lived in Huntsville, which is where my interest in space really developed, and these things kind of gradually came together. But I feel like I live a fairly segmented life, so most people around Nashville know me for one thing or another. It's either being the SAE, audio education guy, or it's being, NASA's man on Music Row, or it's, Kevin, the guy that records these, gritty garage rock bands, So I wear several different hats, but I don't know. You invited me for the interview, so you tell me which Kevin you're interested in.
Man, I like them all, dude. You sent a bunch of great examples of music that you're creating. And we've got the kind of indie rock bands that just sound cool to me and just take me right back to the 90s and the stuff that interests me. We've got the soundtrack you did for Teslafy Me, the movie about the history of Tesla, and it's awesome. So we would definitely want to dig into that. And then I remember when we were chatting, you started talking about this NASA project. So let's start with the band stuff a little bit.
Sure.
Talk about some of the band stuff that you're playing and bands you're recording, and just any fun memories about that.
Well, I grew up being sort of the bedroom warrior with a Tascam, and learning how to get those reverse guitar sounds that I hear on the Jimi Hendrix "Are You Experienced" album by flipping my cassette over, by accident, and realizing, oh, that's how they did that, and playing with the pan knobs and be like, ooh, this is cool, and just falling in love with the process and realizing, this is a big deal for me. Like something really clicked. Like I want to pursue this. I want to take this further. Like, and then realizing that this is actually a job. And then how do you get into that?
Did you start with the cassette 4-track, or did you start with the reel-to-reel?
Cassette. I actually went to reel-to-reel after that, so I kind of went out of order. But I started with cassette, coming up in the age of Nirvana. I'm dating myself here. It was definitely the age of the kids with the Tascams and the cassettes, and in recording yourself and kind of figuring it out the hard way, living in a town where nobody else did this stuff and just trying to figure it out. There was no internet, there were magazines. There were books here and there, satellite television, watching Canadian MTV. It was Much Music. That was kind of living vicariously through the things that were going on in other places of the world and just being kind of starved for culture, I'll put it that way. And then eventually discovering the culture that was all around me all along.
You want the critical details from your microphone to get through to your recording, and the Spectra 1964 101 amplifier provides just that. With unequaled headroom, low noise, and a linear output, irrespective of transient audio peaks. Used by Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, and The Record Plant on records by ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, and John Lennon, Spectra 1964 brings that same incredible sound to your studio with the new STX 600 mic pre with built-in comp limiter. Start making classic records again at Spectra1964.com. Are you sick of microphones that make your music sound harsh and brittle? The new Amethyst mic by Jay-Z Microphones brings you a rich, warm tone with perfect detail using the golden capsule technology. Resulting from 30 years of microphone design, the Amethyst is hand-built using carefully selected parts with Class A discrete circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and an advanced shock mount to make sure your recordings sound awesome. This is my voice on the Amethyst right now. Use the limited time coupon ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the Amethyst mic at jzmic.com. How quickly did you feel like you needed to come up to a place like Nashville to do?
Well,
music?
honestly, I wish I'd done it immediately. And the craziest thing is people were telling me you need to move to Nashville. And at the time I was like, it's country music, and I was a rock guy. And I kind of brushed them off, including my own mom, who's not a musician at all. She's like, you need to go to MTSU. You need to go to Nashville. You need to get involved in that. That would be perfect for you. And it took me years. It took me a long time to eventually get around to that. I wish I'd just gone straight to it.
Had to be your own idea.
It had to be my own idea.
Problem with being a rebel as a kid.
Absolutely. You got me pegged.
Just refused to take suggestions from your parents. Right. Same with me.
So, grew up playing in punk rock bands, playing, in the age of Sonic Youth and, Mudhoney and the whole grunge explosion. Yeah. And then discovering through that, the roots of the music, the Stooges and Bowie and, Velvet Underground, T-Rex, absolutely.
Yeah, there's a video that we included in a playlist, from Kevin where I guess you can tell us about it now. I don't know what your involvement was, but it's sort of a tribute to T-Rex, and you guys did the song Girl, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I co-produced a tribute compilation called Children of the Revolution, a tribute to T-Rex. And it's all Nashville musicians, covering T-Rex and Mark Bolan songs, and just kind of paying tribute to a band that somehow a lot of different people can get into.
Yeah.
T-Rex is honestly not a band that I was totally into growing up. They're kind of on the peripheral, but as I kind of dug in to all the bands that were influencing the bands that I liked, you eventually discover this stuff. And, I felt that it was a really cool project to get involved in getting use the talents and the resources that I had to give a voice to some of these artists. Just a fun project. Also a way to give back. All the proceeds from this project went to which is an organization that promotes educating youth, and I thought it was an excellent opportunity. Maybe jumping ahead here a little bit, but on the subject of this, one of the questions that you said we might talk about was sort of what advice would you have on, if you were in a new city with limited gear, and you wanted to where do you start?
Right.
This is something I actually talk to students about quite a bit. And this is sort of an example of a technique that I like to suggest.
So we'll reinforce that with the reminder, Rockstars. So Kevin teaches regularly at the SAE Institute here in Nashville on Music Row.
Yeah, I'm the career services advisor. I teach workshops from time to time. My biggest thing there is helping to connect students with their first internships, job leads, cultivating their client list, that type of thing.
Cool.
But one way that I'd usually suggest that they start that is to relate to artists artistically. Okay. In Nashville, half the people you meet in the grocery store can record people, right?
Right.
It's a town full of audio engineers and musicians. So artists aren't going to choose to work with you just because you can record them.
Right, exactly.
They're going to choose to work with you based on an artistic connection. You have to connect with them in a way that they feel like you get them. And to me, I think one way to do that is to relate to them through, common artists that you both love. So the concept of a tribute compilation is an excellent way to kind of connect with artists that, you do one for free, you get them hooked like a drug dealer, right? They'll come back.
You're talking about getting bands to come to your studio or come record
getting
with
bands
you.
to come. So do a tribute compilation based on music that you love, something that you genuinely can artistically relate to people on. And once you do that, you get 10, 12, ever how many artists doing these covers of the same kind of thing. A handful of those guys are going to want to continue to work with you. They're going to like the experience.
Smart.
And you're relating to them in a way that building the foundation for further things.
Yeah, you've already got a common ground. In other words, if the band doesn't think T-Rex is cool like you do, they're not going to be on the compilation in the first place. So it's a great way to vet them out.
Right.
Because you don't really want to talk to the bands that don't want to work with you.
Right.
Well, very cool, man. Awesome. And then, am I remembering correctly, the song that sort of put T-Rex on the map for me, was that Bang a Gong?
It was, yeah. That was the big hit.
That was the big hit.
But, T-Rex kind of started the glam revolution, which I'm not a big glam rock guy per se. I love T-Rex. But that's kind of where their piece of the pie is. Them bands like Roxy Music, and you can follow that into all the eventually turning into the horrible hair metal of the 80s.
Well, I think of Bowie when I think of glam too, even though it was like somehow he crossed all those genres. Right.
Yeah, but the stuff in the early 70s when it was first starting, it was a really interesting time period. Kind of the death of the hippie culture. After Woodstock, that kind of era ending. What's next? And glam had a little spark of life to it that at the beginning was cool.
Yeah, well, it was definitely embrace the party too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Glam seemed to exist really well in a club setting where everything was already surreal on a certain level.
Right. And artists like Bowie, they took little bits of that and then they went on to the next thing. Some bands got kind of stuck in doing one little thing. But I think Bowie's a good example of an artist that took something from it and then went on to the next.
Okay, cool. So you came up to Nashville. You also spent a little bit of time in Huntsville, you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
And was that your introduction to the whole Apollo?
Well, really more just sparking an interest. I was just a little kid whenever I lived there, and just driving by and seeing the Saturn V rockets that my parents would never take me to go see, but just driving by them and just being interested in seeing commercials on TV that were all space related, and it just really sparked. There was something there that just, as my impressionable brain, just always wanted to get back to. Now, my dad's a pilot. So it's always around aviation. But the space part specifically, it really kind of started in Huntsville.
All right. So for the rock stars who are not familiar with it, in fact, when I came here, I was like, what do you mean there's space stuff near Nashville? To introduce us to Huntsville and what's going on down there.
So Werner von Braun, the ex-Nazi rocket scientist that came to the United States as part of Project Paperclip, eventually ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, leading a team to build rockets for the United States. The same technology that was used for the V2 rocket, which was used to, decimate England.
Yeah. But might have also destroyed that studio in Russia, huh?
Right. Very well could have been. But no, he ends up in Huntsville. And there's a lot of controversy about that type of thing, but the simple matter is, without these German rocket scientists, we would not have been the first to the moon. Not that we didn't have some great talent in the United States, but it really put us over the top.
Yeah.
And they had a commanding lead on us, which wasn't always the case. If you go way back to the days of the early 1900s, the U.S. was actually way in front. But the U.S. military decided to not invest in rocket technology because it was so demonized by like science fiction media. They saw it as being something really far-fetched. In World War II. Or
controversial for funding too.
Right, probably. Right, exactly. Whereas, between World War I, World War II, Germany was not allowed to spend any money on developing weapons, but rockets weren't seen as being weapons. So they put everything into developing rockets. So that's where they got the commanding lead. It was just one of those weird things of the treaty that was signed. They weren't allowed to spend any money on developing weapons, but that wasn't technically a weapon.
So another connection back to the projects you're working on, Tesla. I remember reading in his history that he actually introduced the military back in the Chicago World's Fair in the late 1800s to remote-controlled, radio-controlled submarines, and they were like, "That's ridiculous. We don't not interested in that."
Yeah, absolutely. It goes way back. No, I'm going to really rat hole here and take this another direction for just a brief moment. But you mentioned it, and I've got to mention this because it's such a cool story. Are you familiar with who Hedy Lamarr is, the movie star? Hedy, I may be saying it wrong. Hedy Lamarr. Anyway, she was a brilliant inventor in her own right. She's mostly known as being a beautiful movie actress, but she's also an inventor. And her and a guy named George Antheil invented a technology based on radio control, similar to what Tesla did, that ended up helping to win the war. Now, so the Italian futurists music style in the early 1900s, think, Kraftwerk, right?
Yeah.
But, 60, 70 years before. They were all about deconstructing art and putting a modern kind of slant on it and reinventing everything. So they're using things like air horns and all kinds of cool contraptions for music, and the ballet and the art style was all very futuristic.
Same time of the Bauhaus up in Germany and stuff like that?
Even before, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of inspires that stuff. So George Antheil ends up scoring what's called the English equivalent's the mechanic ballet. So the idea is he has these player pianos that he develops technology to synchronize them. So it's a very atonal sort of modern approach to music. All right, so he develops this. Now, he meets up years and years later with Hedy Lamarr, and they were talking about ways that they could help the war effort. She'd been married to a guy that was a arms manufacturer. She's just in the right place, has the influence. Well, basically what they design is taking his player piano technology and applying it to a torpedo so that it is the random tone thing that was happening, like for this atonal music, was applied to switching the radio frequencies randomly so that they couldn't intercept these torpedoes.
Good Lord, wow.
It's the most interesting thing. So if you've ever heard the Electro-Harmonics random tone generator, the beep, boop, beep, just random tones, like every sci-fi movie from the 50s, right? Just random tones.
Random sample and hold stuff and all that,
Yeah, he invented that. But they applied it to torpedoes and helped to win the war.
Good.
So it's a perfect example of art influencing science.
Yeah, because we always think about science,
influencing art.
Wars, and,
right.
The military sort of influencing technological advancement, which then influences music. But it's interesting to hear that it reversed like that.
Yeah, it goes both ways. But anyway, sorry to rat hole the conversation there. But you mentioned the radio control. That's a really cool one.
All right. So, you got fascinated with the space industry, and you came up to Nashville. You started doing indie rock stuff.
Yep.
Some of the bands that you recorded and shared with us, I had some questions about those sounds because they're really, really cool sounds.
Please.
So, like, for example, the Sub Rosa Columbia. One of the things that I thought was kind of fun was just that drum sound, that classic 90s kind of like big, almost Albini-esque 90s snare sound. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about getting that kind of drum sound.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'll have to remember that specific session. But for me, I'm pretty standard with what I do with the snare. So it's probably this. It's probably an Audix i5 on the bottom and a 57 on top. It could be a Electro Voice 635A on the bottom.
Okay.
Either way, I tend to put a mic that's just a little bit more articulate on the bottom of the snare.
Just to get the character of the snare.
It's the same thing's putting a 57 and just EQing it slightly.
Yeah. It definitely had like a big room, like a
right.
Kind
now,
of sound
you're probably talking a little bit more about the actual reverb. And it is actually not a reverberant room. That's probably just Altiverb.
Okay.
Altiverb is, I'm really big on reverb. I'm a surf guitarist.
Yeah, totally.
Also. So I'm very picky about reverb. But I love Altiverb and I'm the guy who will abuse it.
What are some tips or tricks for using Altiverb that we should be aware of? And what is Altiverb? Why,
right.
I mean,
so
is that the only one we can use, or can we use something
impulse
else?
response reverb. So you have access to the sound of the best acoustic spaces in the world. They've gone around and collected impulse responses from temples and cathedrals. And really interesting sonic spaces. It puts it at your fingertips, and that's something that just did not exist until recent years.
Yeah. And then are we likely to feel like impulse response reverbs are the ones that we are cool with when it comes to drums? Because I know drums can really bring to light the shortcomings of digital reverb sometimes, where you're like, we were just talking about this recently too, where you hear it and you're like, that doesn't sound right, Right.
Well, you have to use your ears. One of my favorite quotes is by Joe Meek. He says, if it sounds right, it is right.
Nice. Yeah, that's right.
And that's all there is to it. I mean, if it sounds right, it is right. There is no one trick that always works for anything.
Yeah.
If I were to give any advice, it's don't always do anything.
Do you feel like you can give us an introduction to who Joe Meek is?
Oh, absolutely. So Joe Meek is, a British producer from the late 50s, early 60s, who more or less invented psychedelia, if you really want to get down to it. The music that he made in that era kind of bridged the gap from the schmaltzy late 50s pop through the space age and into the birth of the swinging London. He was responsible for a lot of techniques, especially that kind of bridged the gap from the novelty record era into the beginning of the psychedelic album era. He was the guy who really first introduced a lot of really influential British musicians to the concept of the engineer being equal partner in sound creation, not just capturing. Nice. And for me, my aesthetic, my overarching kind of philosophy when it comes to the recording studio is that tone is more important than fidelity. And I think people get caught up on the idea of fidelity, which is great in sort of the hi-fi. If you're buying a record player, great, you want fidelity. If you're talking about building a theater, you want fidelity. But the recording studio is not about fidelity; it's about tone. And what I'm getting at there, if you look at the definition of the word fidelity, what is it? It's about being true to the original.
Right.
And for me in the studio, I don't want to be true to the original. I want to create something better. Unless I'm recording like a classical thing in a beautiful sounding room that's just exquisite as it is. Otherwise, I want to mess with it, right? I want to make it better than real life. I want to create some mystery. I want to do something else with it. So yeah, for me, my overall philosophy is, I want to create something that's bigger than life. So to me, it's tone over fidelity. And I don't think people think in those terms often, because to me, it's a sliding scale. Which way is it? Do you want real life or do you want something even better? So
you want something cool. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. It's a great way to put it. Fidelity, the idea of like a very high fidelity recording, it's one of those challenges that came along with digital as digital got better too, where it was like, all of a sudden it's, people start finding that they need to find out ways to do plugins to kind of mess with the sound again, to get it cool again, because it's like,
it was happening naturally before.
Yeah. If it's just sort of like a boring, clear picture of something, and then it turns out that the something you got a recording of wasn't all that interesting sounding to begin with.
Right.
You want to start like manipulating it to get it to sound cool.
It's the equivalent of, digital cameras getting watching movies or television. I'm thinking of like some of the high definition like news reports. It looks so clear. Or like a zoom in. Say you zoom in on an actress's face, and it's so clear. Now you see a bunch of pores and stuff, right? And it kind of you've gone too far. Now she's no longer beautiful. Well, or maybe that's a harsh way of saying it, but you get the point of like you overshoot. You get to the point where it's no longer better.
It's distracting.
Right. It's no longer better. It's more real, but is real really what you're going for?
Right. If you're ready to upgrade your studio to the famous sound of API's large format consoles, then you're ready for the Box, a small format console featuring the same analog circuitry and original 2520 op-amp design that has made API famous for 50 years. Record through 8 world-class mic pre-channels, mix through 24 smooth-as-glass faders, and blend mics, analog effects, and parallel compression at the speed of electrons rather than the speed of your computer latency. Upgrade your home studio to legendary status with The Box from APIaudio.com. Well, so I've been rewatching with my daughter all the Star Wars movies and going back and seeing, episode 4, 5, 6 again. I was just so struck with how beautiful a lot of those images look. And, they didn't have all this hi-fi digital stuff that they can use now for detail and things, but it was like, is really good. It's so great. One of the nice things about not having too much fidelity is I think it forces you to go back to the roots of your story and make sure that that the power lies within the story and the message you're doing musically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of it. Do you want a digital photograph or do you want an oil painting? I want the oil painting.
I don't know. They're both pretty good if you're doing well. All right, cool. So let's see. Let me ask you another question about one of these cool bands you recorded. The Tremolo. You're a big fan of reverbs and tremolo.
Yeah.
And so Sub Rosa, again, had a great tremolo that's in sync with the song. That used to be such an impossible thing to do back in the day. And I remember the Smiths did it best. Where you're like, how did they do that?
Yeah.
Is that still a challenge today, or do you feel like tremolo is no longer an uncharted frontier?
Well, I think it's easier than ever for a lot of different reasons. I mean, on one hand, you can, there are good sounding tremolos in the box, but to me, I still like the tone of tremolo from an amp.
Yeah.
And I go pretty deep into it, which I'll talk about that in a second, but it's about getting a sample of that tremolo from the amp into Pro Tools, and then map out and find out what the actual tempo is, and then base everything around that. So it's about whatever that's that one thing that can't move. Base everything around that is kind of the philosophy.
Find the inflexible sound, which is the tremolo coming out of the amp. And then base your song structure around that.
Exactly.
In Pro Tools.
But it's easy enough in Pro Tools now to actually find out what the actual BPM should be based on the speed of the of the tremolo, as long as it's not fluctuating on your amp. Which
let's break it down a little more. Talk about the first step of something like that. So you've got a guitar, you're rocking a guitar part through the amp. The tremolo sounds awesome. What's the first thing you're going to do to start?
The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just have the guitarist just play a chord, let me record it, and put it in Pro Tools, and then actually measure it out, and then convert that into the actual BPM of the song. Okay,
so then you'll put a click track in Pro Tools. But how do you start playing along with that click track? Now, isn't your tremolo now not synced up again from the amp, or?
Well, I mean, this is going to depend on the song and the band and all of that. In some bands, you won't even need a click. Sometimes the tremolo is the click.
Right. If you can really hear it while you're
if you can really hear it, right. But sometimes, no, you literally do set up a click based on, or for me, often it's not even a click. Something as annoying as a click, but maybe just a basic drum groove that you'll later take out, but you use it basically as a click, but it's something that's perfectly in time,
Okay, but if you're playing the guitar, how do you get that drum groove to actually start at the right, not start halfway between a beat of the tremolo or something like that?
I see what you're getting at. Well, being that it's going to go away, it won't matter.
Okay.
Because that drum groove is going to go away. It's just a matter of having a solid start and stop point that everything else can go along with, if that makes sense.
Okay, dig. And then one of the other tracks, Mumsies, another one of your recordings. It's got a really great tremolo vocal effect.
Yeah.
Was that also an amp to get that?
I would have to remember, so I'm pretty big on different types of tremolos. One of my favorite is it's technically called Harmonic Vibrato. It's on brown face and blonde Fenders from the early 60s, which for me, being a surf guitarist, that's kind of the golden sound.
All right.
It's the era in between tweed and blackface, one that's often overlooked, but for me, it's the perfect combination. It's a little it's grittier than the blackface, but it's it's the perfect right in between. The tweed's got all that grit. Blackface has got all the headroom. It's like right in between. But they had something very special with the tremolo circuit on those. It's something like, I'm not mistaken, like 5 tubes just for the tremolo.
Wow.
And it's technically not just trim. It's an EQ that is filtering back and forth that actually makes it a little bit closer to a univibe, sort of in between a univibe and tremolo, because it is actually filtering EQ just a little bit. The overall effect is a pulsing of volume, but it has a squishy sort of feel to it that actually gives it tone. It's a really, really cool sound.
In other words,
you hear it on a lot of early Ventures records.
Doesn't just feel like you're turning the volume knob up and down.
Exactly. Though that can be a cool thing too. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum would be, think of the tremolo that is on Vox guitars from the 60s, the built-in tremolo that was on those circuits. In the guitar.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, like the teardrop guitars, they had really cool fuzz and tremolo circuits built into them.
Love that idea.
And those are extremely choppy. I mean, they are just absolutely square-waved, just as on and off as you can get. But that's also a really cool sound. Like this old Spaceman 3 records have that sound all over them. And that's another really, really beautiful trim sound, completely different. And then, for me, probably the one I use the most, I've got a 63 Vibraverb. And it's got the Swedish tremolo. It's kind of a really strong pulse.
Wait, did you say Swedish?
Sweetest.
Sweetest. All right. I'm like, wow, it's like Swedish House Mafia. We got Swedish House tremolo.
I could sit here and nerd out on tremolo all day.
Yeah, but it's great, man. I love it. So my question to follow up with that is, what's the difference between tremolo and vibrato?
Well, it's about, or if you're fluctuating the pitch or the volume. Tremolo is the volume.
Louder, softer.
Exactly.
Technically, although like you
louder,
just described.
softer, or even completely on and off, or anything in between. In vibrato is the pitch going up and down. Now, Magnetone is famous for having actual vibrato on their early amps. And eventually, it was brought back in recent years. They brought that brand back, but it was the Buddy Holly amp back in the day. It really probably the best example would be Wham, the old instrumental by Lonnie Mack. That's probably where that sound from the late 50s is most well known.
Not the band Wham?
No, not the band. Lonnie Mack instrumental. Also the string-alongs, they used to use that sound quite a bit. But yeah, they used to build that into the amplifier. Also a very complex tube arrangement to make that happen. But yeah, and then brands like Custom, they have, like I've got a Coupe 72, and it actually has tremolo and vibrato, and you can even mix in between, which is really cool.
That sounds awesome, man. That sounds super fun.
And matter of fact, I think that may be what was actually on the Mumsies recording, was that one. So you can kind of blend between vibrato and tremolo.
Now, another thing that I think of is like the Fender Rhodes amps, where they made it stereo by, I think, having tremolo that was alternating on left and right side, so that you sort of loud on the left, and then that gets quiet and it's loud on the right. But that bouncing back and forth gives you that whole like Jeff Beck kind of wired sound.
Yeah, there's a pedal that was popularized by Kevin Shields from My Bloody Valentine. It's a Boss Pan. I forget the exact. I think maybe it may just be called Panner. But it's a Boss pedal, and all it does is just ping pongs left and right with multiple amps, which is a really, really cool effect.
Yeah. I guess probably there are digital pedals like my Eventide H9 will do that too. It can definitely control left and right like that.
Yeah.
There's some new pedals. I also just bought a pedal for my stepdaughter's birthday. I just decided I was going to go get her some cool guitar pedals. Actually, it was another suggestion from my other daughter. But I went and I picked up like a Behringer analog delay that was so cheap. It was like $30 or something. It was a Bucket Brigade delay.
Yeah. Is it the big box?
No, it's a little
Okay.
pedal. But are you also a fount of knowledge? You're like better than Google, dude. Are you also a fount of knowledge for like cool pedals we should be exploring and looking for?
Yeah. Well, if you want to talk about a really cool analog delay, the DoD Rubberneck. DoD had a really bad stretch of time where their pedals just sucked. Just really, really bad. Got a bad reputation there for a while. But they have really, really turned it around and put out some awesome pedals lately. And the Rubberneck is fantastic. So it's got a second button on the side where you can press it with your foot just to turn up the feedback.
Oh, cool.
So you can, have almost like a slap back, if you will, right? But when you want it to feedback, hit that button with your toe, and it'll just continuously feedback as long as you want it. It goes to infinite. But it's all like a really, really nice analog circuit inside. There's nothing digital about it. And it's got tone for days. That is a pedal I'm pretty excited about.
Okay, cool, man. That reminds me of my old Boss distortion. It was like heavy metal distortion / feedbacker. And I remember learning that you'd have your distortion sound, and then if you wanted to, you just hold your foot down on the pedal and you just hold it down and it would just go like,
yeah, I've got the silver feedbacker pedal myself. I use it all the time. I'm big on controlled feedback.
Yeah, I love it.
I love teetering on the edge of out of control.
I know, it's tricky. So actually, let's talk about that before we take a break. One of the challenges with doing that, we live in a studio world where a lot of times it's nice to be in the control room to do your overdubs, especially with a guitar. But sometimes, you're grappling with the question of like, is my guitar actually going to be better if I'm in the proximity of my amp? So do you have any thoughts on the power of keeping your guitar on a short leash to the amp versus taking it into the control room and getting your overdubs?
Well, it's all about tone, but at the same time, it's also about comfort.
And playing the right part, hopefully.
Right. I guess my overarching philosophy is whatever is conducive of creativity is what you should do. And this is a larger philosophy. Like somebody told me once that they would rather spend money on a comfortable couch than the latest gear for their studio.
Nice.
And I 100% believe in that philosophy. So it's about comfort. It's about whatever makes that guitarist or whatever musician comfortable to make their art. And if that means that they are right in front of their amp, do it. If that means that they are separated from it so that they can hear better, do it. Whatever it is, whatever makes them comfortable is ultimately what you need to do, because the performance is what most people are listening to. Mm-hmm. It's not the fidelity. It's not this. It's not that. It's the performance. Performance is king. I can sit here and debate about tone versus fidelity all day long, and there's merits for both in different situations. But ultimately, it's the performance.
So if you don't know already, then the answer is allow the guitar player, if it's somebody else or yourself, to discover. Try it near the amp, try it in the control room, find out which one works better for you.
Absolutely. Now, we're speaking in very general terms here, and realistically, it'll probably mean that you'll just change it depending on what part of the song you're on, right?
Yeah.
If we're talking about like while they're tracking the thing, then you'll find where they're most comfortable. But there may be this part of the song where they need to get feedback, so yeah, they got to be in there with the amp.
Yeah.
So it may change a little here and there, but you're going to judge as you develop relationships with these artists what their comfort level is.
Yeah. Dig it. All right. Well, let's take a break now. We'll come back in a moment for the jam session. Reminder, Rockstars, we've got links to what we're talking about in the show notes. You definitely want to go listen to the music that Kevin's creating. Go check out the soundtrack to Teslafy Me. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. When we come back, we're going to dig deeper into talking about playing the Theremin, composing retro-futuristic music for film and bands, and we'll see you guys in just a moment for the jam session.
All right.
You know what it feels like when inspiration hits and you want to capture your great song idea, but then the studio gets in the way and it's just no fun anymore. Wouldn't it feel awesome if you could simplify the process of producing your music from inspiration to final masterpiece? PreSonus Studio One is a powerful digital audio workstation that helps you compose your music with a complete collection of virtual instruments for keyboards and drums, MIDI tools for hip-hop, EDM, and film, a flexible sketchpad with chord charts and key recognition for songwriting and arranging, and classic effects pedals and amp simulators for guitar and bass. With 37 high-quality effects plugins, integrated Melodyne, and drag and drop flexibility, you can easily edit and polish your mixes. And Studio One is the only DAW with a built-in mastering studio so that you can take your record from writing to radio ready all in one place. Download your free version of Studio One Prime and get started now at PreSonus, wherever sound takes you. If you're using a Mac in your recording studio and you're tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly, then Otherworld Computing is the solution for you. OWC can help keep your existing Mac and studio current and relevant so that you can make great music. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac, you can get the most mileage out of your studio with OWC. Offering a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49, there's no need to get frustrated when you can achieve the speed to create and the capacity to dream at OWC.com. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Kevin White joining us here at the studio. We're going to dig in now to talking about Theremin, Tesla, all kinds of cool stuff. Kevin, you ready to jam, dude?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Awesome. So you did this incredible soundtrack for Teslafy, the movie, and it's beautiful. And we've got a link to it in the video playlist in the show notes. So Rockstars, make sure to check that out. But tell us the story behind that and creating that whole thing.
Yeah, you know, the whole project is, there's just all types of serendipity involved. I was in LA for the Grammys back in 2015, 16, and I was locked out of my Airbnb. At the same time, another person staying there was locked out, and we had a little conversation. You know, here's who I am, here's what I'm doing. Anyway, she was a filmmaker from Slovenia, working on a documentary film about Nikola Tesla, and I was like, you don't understand how big of a huge Tesla nerd I am. Like, yeah, seriously, you don't understand. So we had this, just immediately hit it off, this conversation about the project that she was working on. So we kept up with each other over Facebook for a few years. And anyway, for Christmas, I got a Nikola Tesla t-shirt. And my wife knew I was a huge Tesla nerd also. So my son and I, we play surf music together, a little fun little family project. Like, well, let's do a Tesla-themed song. So I was like, what's some music that would be related to Tesla that would be fun to do? So I was like, I know who to ask. So I sent a message to Ianya, and I was like, what's some music that would be Tesla-themed? Instantly, she's like, Tom Odaleko. I was like, okay, what's that? She's like, it's a Serbian folk song. It was played at his funeral. It was like his favorite song.
Wow.
Like a classic Serbian folk song. So we were off for a Christmas break, and I've got a home studio. So we just recorded a version of it real quick and sent it to her. And she's like, did you literally just record that and send it right back to me? I was like, yeah. And she's like, I love this. First of all, I love it. But I also love the fact that you can send me something that quick. She's like, can I use this on the documentary? He's like, sure, absolutely. Go for it. Like the next day, she's like, Kevin, look, we've been trying to go for a different direction on the music for this and trying to figure something out. And I love what you did with this. How would you like to do the music for the whole film? Whoa, how long do I have? She's like, well, that's kind of the kicker. It's like, you got a month because we're going to present this to Elon Musk at the end of the month.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
I was like, what? So it was just this huge opportunity just in my lap all of a sudden. And I was like, oh, I can't say no. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to make myself do this. It's one of those things of just say yes and then figure it out later.
That's such a trip, man. So you were able to do it? You're able to like turn around a whole soundtrack in a month?
You did the whole thing in a month. So it became this thing of, okay, all hands on deck. So called in a couple of friends that are multi-instrumentalists, Jack Faulkner and Adam Reeve from the Nashville rock band Telephones, another band I'd work with, but also just good personal friends. And, we had a few little songwriting sessions where I'd have a motif and like, let's fill this out. And we would kind of jam and get some of their input. I'd write a part, they'd write a part, my son would write a part, and then I would take all this stuff at night and kind of fill in the gaps and mix it, and we got it all done. I mean, it was one of those things where like I was sleeping maybe 2-3 hours a night for a month. But yeah, got it done.
Wow, man. Wow. So how do you even approach something like that when you're like, do you now start looking at the picture and composing?
Well, it was a learning experience. And honestly, I can't say I did it the right way. I learned the right way by doing it the wrong way, of course.
Right.
Here's what would happen is she would send me a rough clip, and then I would score to that. And then she would go and edit it, and then the music didn't make sense anymore. Right. So I'd have to re-edit that, and it was just this constant push and pull. Going forward, when I work on those types of things, I need a finished cut that's pretty, so I can have things timelined properly. But real life, you don't always have that luxury.
Right.
But no, sometimes it would just be a matter of I want this mood, I want this theme. So like a loving heart theme, or a suspense theme, and then we just put it in place however it needs to be.
So let me ask you right off the bat. So if you're thinking of a loving heart theme, what are some first thoughts that come to mind for composition? And then suspense, what are the first thoughts that might have popped into your head about what you
suspense, that stuff's easy for me. That's kind of more my wheelhouse. The heart theme, the love stuff was a little more difficult. I had to stretch a little bit for that.
What is it? When you say that's my wheelhouse, what does it equal?
So I'm really big into like spy themes and horror movie soundtracks. That's just kind of my thing. So what are some components there? So, maybe obviously things like minor keys, dissonance, augmented thirds, those types of things. Lots of tremolo picking, kind of I don't know. It's a style that kind of feels pretty natural to me. Heart themes, it's a little different. What I ended up using as a motif is I envisioned being at the Chicago Exposition in the late 1800s and kind of imagined kind of like how this might feel like a magical experience to like a young kid that was seeing this world of the future at the birth of probably the greatest century, the 20th century. Just all the things are about to happen in this magical feeling. And I was thinking of the sound of sort of pipe, or not pipe organs. I'm forgetting what the term is. I wanted to recreate that kind of
like calliope. No,
maybe kind of like calliope. I think that might be the word I'm looking for. So what I did is I took a bunch of root beer bottles and filled them with various amounts of water and would blow on them and get the pitch, and then did that for every note, and it went as far with it as I could. And created a kit in contact with that, and created this really cool kind of just kind of majestic, kind of calliope, I guess, kind of a sound that I don't know, it felt right.
But what did you try and create a sound that goes like whoo? Or is it something that like where you use looping and you make it sort of sustained, but you have the breathy tone on
so
top?
I would hold, in the loops, I would hold it out as long as I could. And then in contact, be able to loop that so I could sustain it.
Okay, all right. So it's like long legato stuff.
That's. But you could also, you could do the staccato stuff as well. But I really wanted to be able to sustain it. So it's about getting my breath as deep as I could and getting those notes as long as possible.
So talk a little bit about this, because I thought about this when I was listening to your music, how effective you were at going from different kind of genres and stuff, and each one was very believable to me. Like, I'm like, oh, this makes sense. Talk about the importance of character in music and creation. Like, how important is it to put yourself in the character of the instrument or the song or the story you're trying to tell?
That may be the best question. I mean, music is character. It should be character. If music has no character, it's not even. It's craft cheese. You know what I mean? It's got to be about character. And what you see so much in music these days is fake character, and it's so transparent.
Yeah.
To guys like us that know the real deal, it's just obnoxious, right? So I don't know. Character is everything. Being genuine. About just being earnest. I don't think people know how to be earnest anymore. They don't. Yeah,
the importance of being earnest.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think we live in such a jaded world, especially, showbiz and, people trying to, get ahead and all that. I don't know. People just aren't earnest anymore. And I think you have to get down to the heart of whatever it is that you're working on and just be true to it.
I like that you just said whatever it is too, because it's like, it could be so different on any given day, depending on what you're creating, whether it's a hip hop track or whether it's, a surf guitar or a long theremin note. And again, I feel like I see this often when I'm working with somebody who might be singing on the mic, and I look through the window, and if I see them there and they got their hands in their pockets and they're standing there, I'm like, is that really the expression of the voice and the character you're trying to communicate in this lyric? If it is, great. Yeah. But if it's not, then it's like, just be that character somehow.
Right. Well, to me, I think maybe a larger perspective on art is that you have to give art enough space to be whatever it wants to be. You start off with an idea of what you're going for, but don't force it, because ultimately, like say you're working a piece of wood, you're going to have a knot here and there. Right? You got to leave those in place. You got to work around those. You got to work around those natural characteristics and not try to make them a blemish, but make them a natural feature, right? That's what beauty is. Yeah. It's about framing the natural features that are already there, not trying to force something into the box of what it's not.
Yeah, that's deep, man.
My overall arching kind of philosophy on art is that it's about leaving enough space to let the art be what it wants to be.
So do you find yourself trying to share some of that thinking with people to encourage them to find their own voice in their music too?
Absolutely.
'Cause you must be working with students who are like, I want to write this song, I want to say this thing, but all I see is my blemishes. All I see is how bad my lyric is or whatever. And I mean, you're witnessing me just like cringe a little bit because I'm about to go perform my own songs at this live show we're doing together.
Yeah.
But, it's that same thinking. It's like you can find yourself caught in creating music and art in the studio where you're like, I believe in what I'm doing, but if I have to get up in front of other people and believe it out loud, I crumble,
Right. Well, yeah, doing things in a studio and doing things in front of an audience are two very, very different things. There's an art form on both ends of those. And the things that you kind of conceptualize in a studio where you have the luxury of getting it perfect before it goes out to the world is much different than a live situation where you have to be able to just instantly create that. And it doesn't always come across. So those are really two separate art forms. But for me, it's just about approaching everything afresh, anew. Don't always do anything. If I was going to say to always do anything, just always evaluate the situation and be able to feel what it needs.
If you want to capture every nuance of a great performance in your studio, then you're going to need to start with a microphone that is crafted with great care and attention to detail. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia designs amazing sounding microphones that are handcrafted with jeweler's precision to bring you incredible detail in your recordings. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique golden drop capsule design, which uses a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity while avoiding distracting colorations and distortion. sessions. This is my voice right now on the new Amethyst microphone with Class A discrete amplifier circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and advanced built-in shock mount technology to bring an expensive sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTARS to get 50% off the Amethyst microphone at jzmic.com. During the height of record making, Tom Dowd, Muscle Shoals, Stax Studios, Ardent Studios, and the New York City record plant all turned to one company to build their consoles. That company is now Spectra 1964, carried on today through Bill Cheney and Jim Romney. The extremely stable, high-speed circuit design of the 101 amplifier provides unequaled headroom, low noise, and linear output irrespective of transient audio peaks, giving you cleaner, punchier, dynamic recordings. Spectra 1964 brings you the sound of ZZ Top, Aerosmith, Bruce Springsteen, King Crimson, John Lennon, and so many more. Created by the missile engineers who were central in rolling out the systems that protected the free world for over half a century, Spectra 1964 literally brings rocket science to your studio. With the STX 600 mic pre with built-in comp limiter, full-frequency passive BBDI, and C610 dedicated comp limiter, start making records that last a lifetime at Spectra1964.com. Yeah, I like that. Don't always do anything.
Yeah.
Also, it reminds me of a conversation we had before starting this when we were talking about acoustic guitars and the challenge sometimes of what an acoustic guitar sounds like on stage with a pickup versus, you know, how you might compose it when you're using a microphone in the studio. And you want to share any thoughts about that? That also led us down a great path of well, you brought up the James Bond guitar.
Oh, right. Well, a live acoustic guitar is a real difficult thing for me. I just hate it. I hate live acoustic guitars.
But it's not the guitar's fault, right?
It's not.
It's the pickup.
Right. It's the awkward situation of it being put into a PA type of an environment. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of acoustic pickups that are intended to make it sound like an acoustic. I'm a fan of putting a microphone in front of it, but I'm also a fan of putting pickups on acoustics that are more intended to make it sound like an electric. So the example that I gave was Vic Flick, the guitarist for the John Barry 7, which is most famous for doing the James Bond theme. And if you can think about that sound, it is one of the greatest guitar tones of all time. And it's a Clifford Essex archtop guitar, a really large hollow body guitar with a D'Armond Rhythm Chief 1000 pickup on it. So if you take the combination of a really, really big body and then a really beautiful single coil pickup, you just get this beautiful tone. And so many people have tried to get that without going to the source of what it actually was. People try to play a Strat or, the easy
that's
things.
I have a Strat, so I would have grabbed that probably.
It's Strats or Strats, but this is a different thing. This is, if you've got an ear for tone, you gotta dig a little deeper.
Yeah. It's amazing how different guitars can sound from each other. And it's this is an encouragement for me, you, and all of you rock stars. We are allowed to have 20 guitars, and there's a reason why we're allowed to have as many as we want, because they all sound different.
Oh, absolutely. They do. They sound considerably different.
No more excuses. We're not apologizing for how many guitars we have anymore.
No. But that being said, you also have to find your sound. You got to find what is it that is uniquely you. And that's a journey that might take a whole lifetime. And for some people, it may happen with the first guitar they buy. Some people get lucky like that. I've been a bit of a gear hound for a long time, and I've gone through guitar to guitar seeking this thing, and I think I finally kind of found it. And I think it was right in front of me all along, and it was the Duane Eddy tone.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the sound of a D'Armond single coil pickup in a big hollow body. And you'd be amazed at how much of the rock and roll that came from the late 50s, early 60s were all trying to get that sound but they could not get it. And it's because they just had the wrong equipment. But a lot of the late 50s, early 60s instrumentals, the surf music, all that stuff, they were all trying to get this Duane Eddy tone, and they're just going about it the wrong way. They're trying to use, solid body guitars, which are great and it's had their whole new thing. Then it turns into surf music. But no, this big hollow body twangy thing that Duane Eddy got, it's because he's just about the only guy that was playing with those D'Armond pickups other than, say, Chet Atkins, though he was playing a little different. But the rock and roll guys, they would get these big hollow bodies, crank them up loud, and they'd feed back, right?
Right. That's
so then the bodies
right?
start shrinking. They start putting humbuckers, all this kind of stuff. But you kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater in that situation because the tone was right there at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Think of guys like Scotty Moore with that ES-295, the gold guitar he played. Big open hollow body P90s. Now you try to crank it up and play metal, yeah, it's going to feed back, but that's not what it's for. But think about that tone, man. Oh, it's just right there. Now, it's not just the equipment, though. Tone is also in your fingers. And I had this realization in a situation at SAE. A real legend was working there, a guy named Alan Shacklock. He's produced tons and tons of big-time artists. Also, a world-class guitarist. He was on the list of, I think it was the top 100 guitar solos of all time in Guitar World magazine at one point. As far as the solo he did for the song The Mexican with the band Babe Ruth. Excellent guitarist. Well, anyway, we had a situation where we were, for a workshop, we were recreating Apache by the Shadows, and we're going back trying to recreate the exact sounds, the exact tones, and everything's set up. It sounds great. And I'm in the control room, and at one point, it just starts sounding like garbage. And what happened? It was just somebody else playing the guitar. That's all it was.
Yeah.
So it was just, that was a moment, an epiphany of there is more to it than just the gear. There's also technique. There is actually tone in your fingers as well. But also things like your guitar pick, your strings. Mm-hmm. Those are all things that matter. Talk
about the guitar pick a little bit, because you seem to have strong opinions about favorite picks. And
yeah,
how they all
I do. I found my guitar pick, and it is a tortoiseshell 0.63. It's thick enough to get a good grip on it, but thin enough to slap the string right. It has the material. It will brush across the string. It doesn't have that chalky kind of thing. It'll just slide right over it.
Yeah, I think I'm using the Tortex, which probably does have the chalky thing, right?
Exactly, and that's good sometimes for a performance kind of feel, but for me, it's also a combination of that with tone. And I promise you, my pick sounds better.
Okay, I believe you. I remember once I found a pick that I liked, I was just glad to know which one I needed to grab.
Right.
And I think a first discovery is how different a light, medium, and heavy pick are. And they work for different situations. I know, speed pickers, I see a lot of them will use teeny tiny heavy picks sometimes, because it's all about, I guess, you really don't want the pick slowing down how quickly it's plucking the string.
Right. Well, there's not one pick for every situation. I somewhat joke about my perfect pick being the 0.63. And for most things, for me, it is the perfect pick. But, if I want a galloping kind of rhythm, then I want a really thin pick for that.
Right.
Something where I can actually hear the sound of the guitar pick. Was it Johnny Cash Get a Rhythm? That
right.
he would literally put $1 bill in the strings and play it just like a drum. But you can kind of get that kind of idea of that sound in your mind. You're actually hearing the pick.
Yeah.
Right.
And if it's too heavy, you're going to rip the strings off the guitar.
Right. So that's the opposite end. Then you got the guys that play with like coins or even rock.
Oh, wow.
Guitar picks.
Those are intense. I've destroyed my guitar strings.
Now, those are good in another situation. If you're playing in a situation where you've got really thick gauge strings and you're like playing single note solos, so you want to dig in, then sometimes that's the thing. Different.
It really makes sense. Like my daughter's playing xylophone and marimba, and you quickly see that there's a whole variety of different mallets you can play, and it's like the rubber one's hard and it has a different sound. You're like, oh, that makes sense. Sometimes you forget that like that goes for guitar picks too. I remember doing acoustic guitar in the studio and discovering that there are these rubber picks and felt picks, and you're like, what, really? And then you listen to it on a microphone, and it's a completely cool, different sound, and it's you can actually. instead of moving the mic, instead of changing the mic or thinking you need to do EQ on stuff, you can just get a different tone on the acoustic that way.
Cheap thing to experiment with. Felt picks. I was introduced to felt picks when I got an auto harp, and it came with a felt pick just in the case with this old auto harp. And I was like, "What is this?" And it was this whole new tone palette. Speaking of auto harp, we used a lot of either auto harp or other zither type instruments in the Tesla. The Teslafy soundtrack, and part of the trying to get a little bit back on track here.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So part of the concept that I came up with for that album, I called it Electric Christmas, and the concept was taking an old school Serbian string band and mixing that with early electronics.
Yeah.
And when I say early electronics, I mean the things that actually existed back up to the point of Tesla's death in the 40s, like early electronics. So we're taking zither type instruments, banjos, all acoustic, stand-up bass, cello, those types of instruments, and then mixing it with the sound of actual Tesla coils, the sound of electric arcs generated by test equipment.
Now, did you record those Tesla coils in the arcs, or did you have to go look for samples on that stuff?
Both, both. As well as came across a really cool instrument called a Hammond Nova chord.
Yeah.
Which we talked just a little bit about the first real synthesizer, but I ended up buying we used samples of that, but I bought a Hammond Solovox, which is a monophonic, smaller version of the same thing, and just a really cool thing to have a tube synth from the 40s.
Nice, man. Nice. Yeah, I used to have something, I used to have an accordion. I wish I still had it. It was a big one. And when I bought it, the accordion was missing the amp component, but it was called a Quartervox. Mm-hmm. And it had like a big SCSI cable that would go over to the amp. And then the amp was like a tube synthesizer. And so you could dial up synth sounds on it. And I never got to hear it, but I was always so intrigued by what that would have been.
Well, there's a really cool era of keyboards that people forget about in the late 40s and through the 50s and even into the 60s. There were some tube monophonic keyboard instruments that by many definitions are synthesizers that you'll hear in a lot of kind of space age pop era stuff. An example would be Telstar by the Tornadoes, a Joe Meek song. You hear it in the White Stripes. Jack White used one on, it was Icky Thump, right?
Okay.
Yeah, that's the sound. And there are various names for these instruments that are all essentially the same, like the claveline, sorry, I'm spacing on the exact names, but there are a few of these.
You're doing pretty damn good, man, I gotta say.
But there are a lot of those kind of instruments. It's a really, really cool missing piece of synth history.
Yeah. Well, I love it. And Rockstars, I hope you don't mind that we're riffing on this stuff so much. I love being reminded of the history of these sounds. And, we live in a world now where what's possible inside the computer is so compelling and it's so wonderful, but what's possible outside of the computer is also still and has been so amazing. And there's sometimes more room for accidental, when you're recording the real stuff. And figuring out how to mic it up and do whatever with it.
And that's where a character lives.
Yeah.
It's in those accidental things. It's in the warts and all.
Yeah.
And it's about framing those warts so that you see that they are beautiful in and of themselves.
Nice. Warts and all. All right. So you play a particularly cool instrument. It's called the Theremin. Tell us what a Theremin is.
So the Theremin is an instrument, that was invented by a Soviet scientist in 1919. He was working on an early version of motion sensors and realized that if he applied an audio circuit to it, that he could generate a tone by just waving his hand. And it was this huge eureka moment of what in the world have I just created? And it eventually kind of shapes it into a music instrument, though that wasn't the original intent at all. And the Theremin it became the soundtrack eventually of science fiction and horror films and things like that. But that really wasn't the original intent. If you listen to the original recordings from artists like Clara Rockmore or Samuel Hoffman, it was more of a classical instrument. Leon Theremin invented several related similar instruments, including more or less an electronic cello, as well as an instrument that was designed to be controlled not just with your hands but with your whole body. That was designed for ballet, so they dance and make music.
Oh, cool!
Yeah, that's a whole nother side story I could go way down that gets really, really deep. But anyway, as a thereminist, I was able to kind of use some of my knowledge to help NASA, which is kind of part of my story. Is I was fortunate enough to be able to contribute to the NASA Apollo Flight Journal in identifying music that the Apollo astronauts brought with them to the moon. And it's an odd story of kind of how all of it came about, but basically it came down to me being a theremin player and hearing theremin music on these old NASA recordings that I was going through that nobody in their right mind would know, but I do.
That's awesome. So the Apollo missions were taking music with them on these journeys up to the moon?
Absolutely.
Back?
Yes. So they had these Sony, like a predecessor of the Walkman, cassettes players that they would bring with them on these missions for dictation purposes. But they would preload them with music because that didn't weigh anything extra. Everything was about weight for those guys. But putting music on those cassettes didn't weigh anything. So there's a guy that would I'm thinking of his name, I'll think of it in a moment, that would preload these cassettes for them with, music that they would use to commemorate moments. And they would pick out things that were special to them, either to like them and their sweetheart back home, or maybe just something they think will be topical. Sometimes it's just literally just the title, something about the moon.
Right.
But sometimes it's really pointant.
The OG mixtape.
Absolutely. And this is really early for cassette. This is, in the mid and late 60s. Most people didn't know about cassettes just yet. So this is really, really early. I believe it's STC 150, if I'm not mistaken, is the model that they brought with them. But you've probably seen the movie Apollo 13 and seen the visual of the cassette player that's floating around in the capsule with them, and the battery's dying. And
wasn't Tom Hanks in that one?
Yeah. But that was a real thing, So back in 2000, I believe it was 2009, NASA released like tens of thousands of hours of audio recordings from the Apollo missions for the general public to just listen to, do whatever you want. And I'm just the guy who was nerdy enough that I wanted to dig in and start listening to this stuff because I knew, you bring some of these recordings into Pro Tools, you fast forward through the really boring parts, get to the exciting stuff, and you can hear, astronauts, breaking wind and cussing at each other and all kinds of cool stuff.
Is that also public domain where it can be used in remixes? No
absolutely.
Problem. Cool.
Absolutely. And I can get you some links for that. Archive.org keeps a lot of it. Also NASA's website. There's links to all this stuff. Anybody can get to this stuff.
Remind us about archive.org again. Somebody else had brought that up. It's basically a free repository for music and to find music, right?
Oh my goodness. It's got so much stuff. It's hard to even define what all is there. I mean, it's just, it's like the Smithsonian of sound. I mean, it's got everything. But if you've never checked it out, definitely check out archive.org. It's the most difficult part is just searching and finding because there's so much there. It's so much you'll get lost. But anyway, so NASA made this stuff available, and nerds like me will go dig through this stuff and find cool stuff. Well, I get to the point where I'm hearing music, right? Very cool. Okay, well, there's this place called the NASA Apollo Flight Journal where they actually keep the transcripts of what happened on these missions, and they'll kind of detail it from the start to the end, from the launch to to the return, everything that happened, and the audio recordings and the transcription, everything.
Wow.
So you can kind of follow it all. Well, I was hearing stuff in these recordings that's not mentioned in the transcripts, and they're very detailed. And I realized, these NASA guys, man, they're brilliant. They're astrophysicists. They're top of their field, but they're not musicians. And they're definitely not nerdy theremin players that know about Samuel Hoffman. So they didn't know what they had. But
they were taking theremin music up to space with them?
Right. So this album, and I brought it, I know you guys can't see this, but I'm holding it up to Liz. There's this album called Music Out of the Moon.
Nice, man.
Now, this is known as the first Exotica album. Okay. It's Harry Revel, Samuel Hoffman's the theremin player, Les Baxter is the name tagged on this one, but it's one of these theme albums from the days when albums were literally albums. And when I say album, I mean literally like you flip and you have a different disc for every song.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
It's literally an album.
Oh, those 78s?
Yeah.
Oh, I got a 78 player up in the house.
Let's listen to it.
We might have to go check it out after this.
So anyway, Neil Armstrong was a brilliant guy, brilliant in ways that most people don't even give him credit for. And everything this guy did had meaning. I mean, he thought things out deep, including the music they brought up with him. Okay. So on his cassette, he loaded it with some music to commemorate a moment. It was a song called Radar Blues. It's from this album called Music Out of the Moon.
Yeah.
Now, the Apollo Flight Journal didn't have this notated, but I started noticing a few films that were popping up that were starting to dig into some of the music that were coming from these archives. But even some of these films weren't getting it right. So, for example, the film First Man with Ryan Gosling. That's the first film to actually reference the music that Neil Armstrong brought up with him. They referenced this album, right? There's conversations with him him and his wife. They're in their living room. They put on the album. They're dancing to it. He brings it up with them. It's a romantic kind of notion. He's playing this music back to her from the moon. All that's great. It's just not 100% like factual. It's a romanticized version of what really happened. He really was a fan of the album and really did bring it up with them. But they played the first song from the album, which is Lunar Rhapsody, which is a beautiful kind of love song, right? But the song they actually played is called Radar Blues. The movie got it wrong. But there's a whole separate story that's way more interesting about Radar Blues. So whenever—
Not to be confused with Radar Love, Rockstar.
Correct. Yeah. A song called Radar Blues. Most of you guys have never heard this, probably never will unless you actually go try to look it up right now, which you should because it's interesting. So the story is whenever the lunar module is descending and they're about to make they're making their final approach, they're about to land, all these alarms start going off. 701, 702 alarms, they're going off. I may not have that number correct. I think that's right. These alarms are going off, and they're almost going to abort. I mean, they're having to get confirmation from ground control about whether or not they can continue because they don't even know what these obscure codes are. Well, turns out these are radar alarms that were going off because Buzz Aldrin was holding down the button too long, basically, and overriding the computer. But anyways, they were having the radar problems. And the funniest thing was that he'd already picked out this music. There's a song called Radar Blues.
That's hilarious. Was it playing at the same time?
No, it wasn't actually playing at the same time.
But it was with him.
But it's an interesting little note that was like the notable, one of the notable things that actually happened in getting there.
That's a trip, man. It would be hard to describe in one sentence what gives records a legendary sound, but it would be easy to describe in 3 letters: API. For more than 50 years, API Audio has created large format consoles for world-class studios. Famous for co-founder Saul Walker's circuit designs and the original 2520 op amp, the sound of API consoles is the sound of great music. API now brings that legendary sound to your home studio with the Box, a small format console featuring the famous API circuitry that is the perfect analog addition for your digital studio. The Box gives you 8 recording channels on the left with built-in mic pre's, high-pass filters, direct inputs, and custom-loadable 500 module slots, and 16 summing channels on the right, or mix using all 24 channels, including aux sends, inserts, and silky smooth faders, feeding a master section with classic API compression, switchable monitor sends, and a Pro TalkBack switch, and you've just upgraded your studio to legend status with the Box from APIaudio.com. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Rockstars of Drums will show you how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Want to start mastering your own records? Rockstars of Mastering walks you through exactly how I mastered my own record using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. Want to learn how to create a mix that doesn't suck but rocks instead? At Mixmaster Bundle, I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins so that you can have punchy, powerful drums, guitars that rock, bass you can feel, and a mix that is in your face. Plus, it's totally free as my way of saying thanks for listening. Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now and look for the clickable link in the show notes below. So you have this, you're a historian of all this stuff with NASA. What's your involvement in the project? Are you actually composing music for something now there, or is it your sort
of... Right. Well, all right. So long story short, after getting credit from NASA for updating their archives with the information of what the music is, the historical relevance, and there's quite a bit there. And then them even sending me stuff for restoration purposes so that they can identify what the music is. And me using like Isotope RX to clean up recordings for NASA, which is the coolest thing when NASA asks you for help, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me.
I hope Isotope realizes how awesome it is what you've done there.
I hope they do too. But anyway, so after that type of stuff, I started getting interviewed by places, a few different places, and it turns into a summer gig at the Adventure Science Center here in Nashville for the 50th anniversary celebration for Apollo 11 and putting together a documentary film to celebrate this and to take the slant of marrying Nashville's music identity with the Apollo history.
Cool.
And marrying those two worlds together has kind of become my niche, right? My niche. And it's called Songs of Apollo. We did a short version, 3 episodes that played at the 50th anniversary celebration. Now I'm working on a full-length documentary. Actually, just this past week, I got approval from Middlesex University to use this as part of the larger project that I'm doing with them. They've assigned me a really cool documentary filmmaker with experience from Nat Geo, and kind of trying to do it right now. We did the quick version for the museum. Now
Nat Geo, it was National Geographic for those in the know. I think, right?
Yeah. So that's what I'm working on now, is doing the full length. Now, I've got some really cool Nashville connections with all this. Like, for example, in 1975, whenever the cosmonauts and astronauts went up for the Apollo Soyuz test project, which, for those that don't know, is the ceremonial end of the space race. It's the point where we go up, we link the Apollo and the Soyuz capsules together, we shake hands in space, and put a ceremonial end to the space race. A couple interesting stories there. First of all, if you're going to pick like the biggest moment, probably the culmination of this huge endeavor, probably the biggest thing humankind's ever done, and you're going to cap it off with a handshake in space, and you have to put some music to that. What are you going to pick?
Hound Dog by Elvis? No, I don't know.
That's cool. That's cool. Well, if you were astronaut Tom Stafford, you asked Conway Twitty to sing "Hello, Darling" in Russian.
Wow, nice.
No joke. That really happened.
Awesome. That's awesome, man. That's awesome.
Well, after that historic moment, they go on a tour and they end up in Nashville. The cosmonauts and astronauts end up here, and they end up sitting in on a George Jones session. And I interviewed the engineer of the session, and had tons of cool stories about it. And they had an entourage of photographers. And he's talking about in those days, when they do a take, man, they do one take, and that may be it. That may be the take. And they're in the middle of this awesome take, and all of a sudden, these photographers all shoot at like the exact same time, and it sounds like a whip going off.
Wow!
So they have to do a little edit and fix it, but they had tons of stories about the cosmonauts coming to Nashville, and just lots of cool stories. I got to interview lots of Nashville musicians whose music has been used as wake up calls for space shuttle and ISS missions. Even my old neighbor was such a funny thing. My neighbor, literally, his band's music was used as a wake-up call for one of the Mars rovers.
Wow.
So there's this whole history of music and space flight. That's basically what the documentary is about. It's the relationship between music and space flight from the perspective of really art and science.
So you become a filmmaker now.
You're overseeing the whole just thing. By necessity.
Now, do you think you'll have to create music to go with it too, or is it mostly pulling from archives?
So far I've created a little Theremin theme.
Nice.
But I'm going to try my best to not put my fingerprint on the music and let everybody else's music do that.
Right.
So, for example, Alison Brown, one of the greatest banjo players in the world, Nashville local, and she has gotten me some really cool footage of a space shuttle a wake-up call where you can see footage. They're literally seeing the horizon and the sun coming up out the window from the space shuttle. In comes her banjo music.
That's great.
And it's just beautiful, beautiful stuff. Also, I've got exclusive footage from astronauts John Glenn and Scott Carpenter that was used for Jon Stewart's funeral, where basically it was their homage to him and his music and the Kingston Trio and him teaching them play guitar and stuff like that, is footage that they used at the funeral. And Jon Stewart's widow, Buffy, sent it to me and was like, use this in the documentary. So it's just really, really cool stuff. And there's lots of the early NASA attempts at getting public support involved music. Specifically the Kingston Trio, Jon Stewart, they were involved with early propaganda, if you will, films like With Their Eyes on the Stars, where they basically take the westward expansion of America and then follow it to its logical conclusion of you get all as far west as you can go, you turn your eyes up to the stars. Wow. And this is all scored by them and, kind of using music as the backdrop, basically a music video. Yeah. So this goes way, way back. Following this to the current day, NASA is with the new Artemis program, sending the next man and the first woman to the moon in 2024.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Awesome.
And part of that is the hashtag NASA MoonTunes initiative. So people can submit music that they would like to have played on the moon mission, and get it on the next mixtape.
All right, so Rockstars, take your next track. If you think it's a contender, hashtag
NASA MoonTunes.
NASA MoonTunes. TOONS or TUNS?
TUNES.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Man.
Yeah.
Well,
so
cool.
Think like Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's great, man. So cool, dude. You're doing so much amazing stuff. And again, I was joking about this earlier, but it's so true, man. You're better than Google, dude. You're more fun to just pick random things about the history of music and NASA and Tesla and just find out as much as we can. You used a variety of instruments doing your compositions also for Teslafy Me. Mm-hmm. And then also, reverbs and delays. I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit more about some of your favorite reverbs and delays for creating ambient music.
Sure,
and things like that.
Sure. Well, I'm a big fan of Altiverb, as I mentioned. I'm also a big fan of spring reverb.
Now, Altiverb, for for just having sort of static room spaces that might work for something?
Right.
Or evolving effects?
No, that's more of a static thing, the sound of an actual space, typically like, cathedrals and majestic spaces, but also eventide space and the black hole presets. I use the software version of that in the film. And when you want to create sort of a Sigur Rós type huge ambience, it's just instant sci-fi.
Yeah, just
instant
the
sci-fi
wash
film.
that goes forever kind of thing.
Oh, it's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
What are some of the things, if you use that, are there any watch outs? Like it works great, but watch out for this one little thing you might want to adjust here or there kind of thing? In other words, get it right.
The obvious things like the mix, a little bit can go a long way. And that's something I have to constantly remind myself because I will go way overboard just because I love it so much. Yeah. So I have to be careful with keeping a handle on the mix so that you can actually still hear the original source along with this huge wash.
Right, okay.
So you've got the articulation there.
What about tonally? Is there anything about the tone that you need to be looking at your EQ adjustments or any of that kind of stuff? Or is it more like what, straight out of the box does the
right? Well,
the thing you need?
It depends. I am a fan of EQing reverbs. And that's something that Alan Shacklock taught me that they do in Abbey Road quite a bit, is that they will EQ the reverb. So having a separate channel just for your reverb, and so you can get EQ on that, and even compression.
EQing the return of the reverb.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, it's all about tone. So I'm glad you mentioned tone, because everything is tone in the studio as far as I'm concerned. In reverb, definitely, absolutely. In finding resonances that are complementary, right? Because think about what a resonance is. It's actually a note, right? So make sure it's in the key of the song, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So use your ears.
Do you feel like the time you spent watching YouTube videos, trying out mix tricks, and tweaking version after version of your mixes has gotten you nowhere? Have you been looking for a simple, straightforward, step-by-step process for creating a pro mix that won't take years to learn? What if you could have a Grammy-winning mix engineer who understood all your mixing struggles and could coach you through them? If you struggle with any of these questions, then the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass is just for you. Now you can discover the proven step-by-step mix system from Grammy-winning mixer Craig Alvin for consistently creating a pro-quality mix from your home studio that will sound amazing everywhere. Here are just some of the things students are saying about the Ultimate Mixing Masterclass.
Absolutely the most informative and helpful block of information and mentoring on the mix process I have ever been a part of. That was like sitting behind a mix engineer for years, watching and picking up tips along the way, condensed into a 6 to 7 hour lesson.
David P.
Thanks for a great session, dude. Just when I needed the inspiration.
John F.
A true feat of greatness. It was really life-changing and worth way more than I paid.
Mark R.
I've literally watched it 2 times at length, taken a plethora of notes, then combed back over some sections even more. You guys really knocked it out of the park on this one, and it was so incredibly eye-opening and useful immediately. What else can I say?
Shane J.
Amazing masterclass with Craig Alvin. My biggest takeaway was the concept of adding a subtle combination of distortion and compression to achieve a buttery cohesion in the sound. But there is so much more.
Steve K. Listen, I appreciate you listening to this podcast, and I know you're trying to make your best record ever. But when you're ready to take your mixes to Grammy-winning quality, then you're ready for UltimateMixingMasterclass.com. What about sometimes when you go to do those super long reverbs and you instinctively might think I'm getting too much like, that kind of stuff. Is that usually a return EQ adjustment, or is that more of like is there a different knob we reach for to kind of darken it and make it moodier?
You're making me question my memory a little bit, because I'm definitely a knob twiddler,
Google,
but I'm definitely a knob twiddler, but I can't say that I've committed to memory every knob on the eventide.
Okay, no worries.
But here's what I don't do. I don't gate reverbs.
Okay.
I like the decays to be natural. unless it's like a real effect. Unless it's going to be like almost like a tremolo chop or something like that. I lived through the big gated reverb snare sounds of the hair metal era, and I kind of rebelled against that with the Nirvana generation, and we wanted to go back to the Led Zeppelin tones.
That's right,
and all that. So for me, I've always kind of been against the resurgence of the big 80s sounds, but I do respect them now. I used to kind of the opposite. Now I respect them for what they are. It's a thing, just like the 60s were a thing and the 50s were a thing. The 80s were a thing too. But my tendency though is to not gate a reverb.
There was a real, conflict, is that the right word? There was a tension between, the Nirvana thing and the Guns N' Roses thing happening at the crossing over right at the same time.
Oh man, it's amazing. What's funny, so my sister is just a couple years older than me, and she was totally into, Bon Jovi and that type of thing. And then I come in and I'm all, Nirvana and by extension, Black Flag and that kind of aesthetic. So it's even within my own household, like the music was just, it was a night and day. I mean, when Nirvana hit, I can remember there was a moment where they sort of unified the geeks and the jocks and everybody, even the jocks were wearing Nirvana t-shirts. And for this brief moment, it was like, here's our Beatles.
Right. It was such a big thing when it happened.
Yeah, but unfortunately though, for a lot of great musicians that were more on the kind of the hair metal end of things, they really got shafted bad. And I've since become friends with guys that were in some of those big bands, and man, they had a hard road. And snotty kids like me were kind of pushing, but that's just the cruel nature of this business is out with the old, in with the new, and that happens all the time. So I'm glad to see things kind of come full circle and find their place again. But sometimes when that zeitgeist shift happens, it can be brutal.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so one last question about sort of like tone and stuff like that. You talk about creating lo-fi sound, and I wondered if you wanted to share any thoughts about techniques for creating lo-fi sound. What is a lo-fi sound?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, in order to find that, you just need to know what fidelity is. And fidelity is being true to the original. And my goal is typically to not be true to the original. It's to create something new. It's to create something greater than existed.
You remember the Xerox machine, right?
Right.
You remember the fun of taking a Xerox and then you re-Xerox that and you re-Xerox that and zoom in and you just come up with something that never existed before.
Exactly. And and that's totally my back in the day, going to Kinko's, making art for album covers with your teenage bands, and you copy the stuff over and over and it looks so gritty and cool. That's a great example. But no, for me, lo-fi is about creativity, really. It's just about creating things that wouldn't exist. And the Joe Meek quote of, if it sounds right, it is right. It kind of comes down to, it doesn't matter if you don't have an SSL console, if all you've got is a Mackie, but you can get the sound that you need, great. That's fine. Don't worry about the process as much as the results, right? And you can get great tones out of all kinds of weird, crazy gear. And sometimes that's the fun of it, is taking a walkie-talkie microphone and using that in place of your Neumann, right? Fun techniques. Maybe you want a Leslie, but you don't have one. Get a 57 or some microphone you don't mind getting dinged up a little bit. Tape up really, really tightly around the jack and swing it around. Literally, the amp may be stationary, but the microphone doesn't have to be. Right? Absolutely, swing it around. Get two amplifiers. Get some separation there. Swing it around. Create your own Leslie. That's a really fun technique.
I wasn't there a story about John Lennon doing that, where like he got up on a chair? Maybe I'm mixing up my stories, but the amp was on the ground, and then you just dangle the mic above it, sort of, and you go around the amp like. I
like to pretend like I invented it, but I'm sure somebody else did before me.
It's great. It's such a great trick, though, and it's that reminder of the things that you can do. in the simplest ways and they're fun, and like when I first discovered the, accentuating the reverb of a space. So this is a trick. I've talked about this before. I'll talk about it again. It's been a while. But if you had 2 jam boxes with cassettes in them, you put one on one end of the room and one on the other, and you just pick whatever space you're in. Maybe it's got some natural room tone to it. And then you read a line of text or something into one jam box, and then you play it across the room, record it on the other, and then you play that back and record it back on the original tape. You just go back and forth, and the words disappear, and all you're left with is this. It's just all the sounds of the room, the tones.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that's literally how I started recording. Was I had a jam box. My sister had a jam box, and I figured out that if I wanted to layer sound on top of sound, that's how I would do it. I'd record on mine, play it back while recording on hers, and then back and forth. And I figured out how to do this, and I thought I'd invented something awesome. And little did I know, guys have been doing this for years and years and years and years, but I thought I'd invented something awesome.
Yeah. Well, when I went to college, I went to go study architecture, but I was playing guitar, and I walked down the hall and I heard some kids playing guitar out of a different room. I was like, hey, you play guitar? I play guitar. It's how you meet your best friends when you're young and you don't get hung up on, I don't know, normalcy. Yeah. And then these guys had the double cassette deck, and they were like making songs by doing the back and forth, and you plug the mic in. And I just couldn't believe it. I was just like, no way.
Yeah, I love inventing things that already existed. A funny story there, small tangent. I taught English in South Korea for 1.5 years after college. And one of our best friends that we made while we were over there, he's like, you've got to try this. I've made this new thing that I love to eat, and I think you will love this. Here's what you do. It's just a sandwich, right? But you put peanut butter and jelly on it. He's like, it's the best thing. Like, he had never heard of that. He literally invented it himself. Little did he know, in America we do that all the time.
Wow, that's pretty wild, man. All right, I think that's a great note to end on. Let me ask you one more question. This one's hypothetical, but we're going to take the Wayback Studio machine, and you go back early in time, and you find young Kevin, and I guess you're bouncing cassettes and making songs and doing this cool stuff. And you say, look, dude, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing that you need to know to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day. What advice would you like to go back and give yourself if you could?
Don't be so hard-headed and actually listen to people that have done it before you.
Nice.
Seriously, don't worry about genre, okay? Even if the people that are making, the albums, the music, are not necessarily from the genre of music that you're into, listen to what they can teach you. Because sometimes they will have perspectives that can give you a whole new lease on your style of music. If you can take, in my instance, if you can take the production techniques from country music and apply it to rock music, oh my goodness, because Nashville, I mean, man, these engineers are so professional, and they've been doing it for so long. There's so much history there. They have figured it out over years and years of doing it. And it doesn't matter what style of music,
Right, exactly. You shared the story about, being hesitant to come to Nashville because it's country or whatever. Right. And then you get there and you start seeing things, and you're like, oh.
Yeah. Well, little did I know that it's also been a rock town all along. I mean, literally, Elvis recorded more in Nashville than he did in Memphis. I just never knew that.
Right.
And guys like Neil Young came here. Bob Dylan came here. I mean, this rock's been here all along. It's just you've got this huge music machine pushing country music exclusively that only kind of exist here, but there's also other things here.
That's great, man.
So.
Well, dude, thanks for being on the podcast with us. Let the rock stars know where they can find you online. Where should they go?
Sure.
If they want to go to school and take classes with somebody who's better than Google, where do they go to school?
Yeah, so my website's kevinthegreat78.com. It has links to whatever I've got going on. You'll find more content coming up in regards to my upcoming documentary, songsofapollo.com. Not a lot on there right now, but there will be really soon. Those that are interested in an audio education, I would ask that you give SAE a consideration, sae.edu. Check out the Nashville campus. I think we're the best.
Nice. You guys are pretty cool, man. Awesome, dude. Well, what a pleasure to have you here on the show with us. Thanks for being here, Rockstars. Reminder that we've got links to this in the show notes. just scroll down. Make sure you go check out the music and check out Teslafy. It's a super cool soundtrack. So
it's on Amazon right now.
Awesome, dude. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
We'll see you around the studio. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever now, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free course at mixmasterbundle.com. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio. Just look for the link in the show notes below. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music. Recording Studio Rockstars would like to give a big thank you to our amazing sponsors who help make this episode possible. OWC, Jay-Z Microphones, PreSonus, Spectra 1964, and API Audio. You will find links to all these wonderful sponsors in our show notes. These are all things I highly recommend for your studio. They're going to help you make your best record ever. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.